In this lecture, we're going to see how we can handle optional output from functions using stdoptional. And we're going to jump straight into an example on how we can do that. This is going to be an adaptation on the function we have used before to find a character in a string, and we're going to adapt them to use stdoptional. Now you see that the return type of this function is stdoptional, which is going to be wrapping around an int type. And inside we're going to do our search. And notice what we do here. If we find our target character, we're going to just return the index. How cool is this? And if the loop goes on and doesn't find anything, we're going to return an empty pair of curly braces, and this is going to return std null opt, or it's going to return an stdoptional variable which doesn't contain anything. And now that we have a function like this, we can use it in the main function, and it's going to be super easy to look at and work with. So we're going to use it like this. We're going to set up two variables, an std string and a character, and we're going to do our search like this. You see, we are setting up a variable which is going to catch the result. The variable name is result, and we are saying find character. We are passing in our parameters, this string here, and the character we want to find. And the return value is going to be an stdoptional variable. Once we have this result variable, we're going to do some check on it before we read some value inside. And we're going to say, if result has value, we're going to read whatever is in this variable here. And we are going to use the value behavior and say result that value, like we have seen in the last lecture, where we were introducing stdoptional. And if we don't find anything, our stdoptional variable is not going to contain anything. It's going to contain std null opt. The block here is going to be activated, and we're going to say could not find our character in the string. This is really cool. Okay, another thing I want you to see is a facility we have with stdoptional to handle default parameters. But before I show you that, I am going to show you the ugly way to do that. So here we have our adaptation of our find character function. It is going to take a string as a first parameter here, but notice that the second parameter has a default value. And we have changed the variable type to be stdoptional, which is going to be wrapping around our character that we are passing here. And the default is going to be std null opt here. Try to take some time and really wrap your brains around this. This is a setup we can do if we want to do a default search on our string without having to specify the character we want to search for. So once we hit the body of the function, we're going to set up the character that we want to find. We're going to say if our stdoptional variable has value, we're going to set the character to find to the value. If it doesn't have a value, we're going to specify the default. For example, here, it's going to search for a Z. And once we have our character to find, we're going to try and find it and return stdoptional like we did in the last slide. This is one way you can do a default search on your string. And this may come in handy depending on the design of your application. But this is really a bad way to do things. We are doing some ugly logic here to try and find our character that we want to find. We can simplify this by changing our code as you see here. And we're going to take out all this ugly logic that we were doing here. And we're going to say card to find equals C value or, and we're going to specify our default. This is a facility we have on our stdoptional type to specify our defaults. And it is going to make working with defaults really easy. So if this is something you need in your application, please be sure to use this to your advantage. Now that you know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and actually play with us. Here we are in our working folder. The current project is optional output with optional. So we're going to grab our template files. We're going to copy that and put that in our project here. And we're going to open this guy up in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping on top here. This is going to open our main CPP file. We're going to clean it up a little bit. And we're going to close this left pane and include our optional library. Let's do that. And we are going to put in our function, which is going to return stdoptional. This function is going to return an index if it finds our character, and if it doesn't find it, it's going to return an empty stdoptional. So we're going to do our search. If we find the character, we're going to return the index as we do here. If we don't find it, we're going to return an empty stdoptional. And we have two ways we can do that. We can either return an empty pair of curly braces, or we can even return std null opt. That's going to also work. We can do something like this. Okay, this is also going to work, but I really like my empty pair of curly braces to really make it super clear that I am returning something empty. Now that we have this, we can head over in our main function. We are going to set up two variables, which we are going to use to play with us. One is going to be a string containing hello world, and the other is going to be the character that we want to find in this string here. We can go down and set up an stdoptional variable, which is going to wrap around int, and we're going to call this result, and the value is going to come from our function call here. We're going to say find character v2, and what we want to search in is str1, and what we want to find is our character here, c. And if we find it, we're going to have information stored in this stdoptional variable. If we don't have information, this is going to contain empty. And we know how to do our checks here. We're going to say if result has value. We can say that. We're going to say stdcout found our character at index. We're going to say that. We're going to say result value. That's how we're going to get access to this. And we're going to say stdendl. And this is a function. We need to put in our parentheses to make this valid C++ code. And we can say else stdcout didn't find our character. Okay, we can try and build this program. We're going to use GCC for that. The build is good. We can try and run it. We're going to bring up a new terminal, and we're going to clear and run rooster here. We're going to see that we found our character at index 15. But please take a look at this function and see how easy it is to look at. We are no longer using these -1s to encode our failures. We're not using any input parameter, which is really not standard. Anybody looking at this function is going to know that you are returning an stdoptional variable, which is going to encode two pieces of information. Whether the return value was an index you can use to do things, or if something you were searching for wasn't found. And we can use this result variable to really get the value if it happens to be n, or say that we didn't find anything. And this is really cool and easy to look at. Okay, so if you really need to handle optional output in your functions, stdoptional is your way. And you notice that we changed what we are wrapping around to make it a size t, because indexes can only be positive. You can't have negative indexes in our string here. So we can even go down and adapt our code to not return an stdoptional that wraps around int here. We're going to wrap around size t. This is a mistake I had made, and I am lucky to have found it because I would have misled you. Hopefully some of you have caught this and you were wondering why I wasn't changing this to use size t, but now it's done. Okay, now that we know this, we're going to see another version of find character, which is going to have a default character we can search for. Okay, we are going to go on top in front of main here and say specify default character to search for. And we're going to put in the function to just do that. And I am going to try and explain it. You see, it is returning the same thing as we did in the first version here, but we have a second parameter which is no longer a character type like it was. Now it is an stdoptional variable wrapping around character. And we are specifying a default value of null opt for this stdoptional variable here. If we go inside, we're going to use this second parameter and try to figure out if the user called our function with a character or with an empty value or the default that we have here. And we're going to set up a variable called character to find. We're going to check if it contains anything. What it contains is going to be our character to find, because that will be what the user specified as a second parameter here. And if it doesn't contain anything, we're going to specify our own default here. And this is where we specify, for example, that we want to search for the z character by default. Once this code is done here, we're going to try and search here, and it is exactly what we have seen in the first example. And if we don't find anything, we're going to return an empty null opt like we do here. Now we can comment our code here to use our second version. So we're going to do something like this. We're going to use the string here. We are going to go down here and put in a piece of code to try this out. We are changing our string to contain str1. Now it is going to search by default, and we can call it with only one parameter like this. And it is going to search with only one parameter like this. And you see that we are using auto-type deduction because we don't want to type the results like we did here, which was pretty long. So this is one way you can do these things here. So this is going to try and search for a z because that's the default. And we're going to say we found z at whatever index it is at. If we don't find it, we're going to say we didn't find z in our string here. And we're going to try and compile this code and run it to see that it really works. So the compilation is going to go through, build is successful, we can clear and run Rooster. Now we're going to find z at index 11 because we made sure we could find it. But if we remove it and build again, the build is going to go through for sure. We can clear and run Rooster. Now we didn't find this guy in our string here. And this is how we can specify our default. If you want, you can even call this function with another variable. And for example, you can specify another character to search for. Let's use lowercase o here. You're going to see that this is going to be valid C++ syntax. But now we need to change this to say we found our character o at whatever index it is at, or we didn't find it. We need to change this a little bit to have meaningful output on the terminal. So we're going to build this again. The build is good, we can clear. And if we run Rooster, we're going to say we found character o at index 4. And if we look 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, our function is really working. But now we are able to specify defaults pretty easily when we call the function. Let's bring this back to the default where we were searching for a z. I want to show you that we have a much easier way to do this using another syntax. Okay, we're going to go back to our function here. And again, this is crazy logic just to find the default. stdoptional has a built-in behavior we can use to simplify this. And we are going to comment this out here because this is pretty crazy. And we are going to go down here and say car to find. And we're going to say this equals, we're going to find our parameter here, which is c. We're going to say c value or. You see, it has a behavior called value or. And this is going to give us the value that is inside, if it happens to contain a value. But if it doesn't contain a value, we're going to specify our own default in this pair of parentheses here. So we're going to say z, which is our default. Hopefully you can see that this really simplified our code to something much more sane to work with. And if we run the program, it is going to work the same way. It is going to find z by default, and we have the option to specify our other search target here. And this is going to make our code much easier to work with. Let's build and show you that it is actually working like it did before. We're going to try and find a z in our string here, and we're not going to find it because we don't contain a z in here. But if we try and put that in, we're going to find it. So we build again, and we are going to clear and run Rooster. We're going to find our guy at index 11, and it is in here. And again, we have the option to specify a second search character. So we can specify O here, for example, like we did before. And we're going to say we are searching for O and O here. And if we build again, we're going to find that. Okay, we can clear and run Rooster. Now we're going to find O at index 4. And this is exactly what we expect. This is really all we set out to do in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. The main topic was to be able to use stdoptional to handle optional output from our functions. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to try and recap what we saw in this chapter. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.